Hello and welcome to the Korea Society's first policy program of 2026, South Korea's Nuclear Submarine Strategy. Thank you all for joining this timely discussion. My name is Abraham Kim, and I am the Korea Society's new president and CEO. During today's discussion, our panel of experts will examine how South Korea's emergent nuclear submarine program will impact Korea's defensive capabilities and strategic posture, its contribution and coordination with the US-ROK alliance, its regional role, and the balance of power and relations with North Korea. The recent agreement between Seoul and Washington that authorizes and supports South Korea's development of nuclear-powered attack submarines represents not merely a major evolution in South Korea's capabilities, but also a deep level of strategic trust and operational partnership between the two long-standing allies. We are honored to welcome three expert speakers for today's discussion. First, we welcome Dr. Sang-hyun Lee, Fellow Emeritus of the Sejong Institute. Next, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Jim Holmes, J.C. Wiley Chair of Maritime Strategy at the U.S. Naval War College. And at last, we welcome Min-kyung Jung, staff reporter for the Korea Herald. Thank you all for joining us. Today's panelists join the Korea Society's policy director, Jonathan Corrado, in conversation. Policy Program Officer Chelsea Alexander will facilitate the audience questions. So please send your questions now and throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. Jonathan, now over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abraham Kim. Good morning, Chelsea.
Morning, Jonathan.
Good morning to all of our panelists, and good morning to all of our viewers. Welcome to this program. We are delighted to have you. Really exciting topic, and going to jump right into it. So let's start with the agreement struck late last year between President Lee Jae Myung and President Trump, where the U.S. approved South Korea's development of nuclear-powered attack submarines and committed to help Korea build them. So Sang-hyun, turning to you first, with your eyes on the ground in South Korea, this is something that South Korea has been seeking for a long time. Why do you think the agreement came together now, and what does this mean long-term for South Korea?
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, and I appreciate the critical focusing this wonderful program. Well, there's two big dreams for South Korean Navy. One is a long dream. One is the small aircraft, and the other one is the nuclear power.
Thank you so much, Sang-hyun. If you could try to use your mic a little bit closer to your mouth, or maybe speak a little bit closer to the microphone.
Let me use my earphone then.
Okay, that will be very helpful. Thank you so much. Min-kyung, turning over to you, because Sang-hyun teed up a lot of important issues here in terms of the devil being in the details. And since the deal was announced, you've reported on a couple of follow-ups that are kind of putting together puzzle pieces in terms of how this is all going to come together. So can you talk to us about what has been announced since the deal and how things are shaping up?
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, let's start with what we know. So the South Korean government is trying to move as quickly as possible to develop a unified whole of government negotiating posture. But one uncertainty remains, which is how far the U.S. is ultimately willing to go, particularly given domestic legal and political constraints. I think that brings us to the first major structural development. South Korea and the U.S. have agreed in principle to pursue a separate bilateral agreement dedicated specifically to nuclear-powered submarine cooperation. This would be separate from the November 2025 joint fact sheet and is intended to address legal constraints under U.S. law, especially restrictions on the transfer of military nuclear material. Our National Security Advisor Lee Sung-lak confirmed in late December that the two sides had agreed to pursue such framework. He said the talks would also encompass uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing in an allied context, with working level consultations beginning early this year, but they haven't started yet. Multiple government sources indicate that this separate agreement would provide a legal basis for exemptions, or waivers under the US Atomic Energy Act, conceptually similar, though not identical to arrangements created for Australia under AUKUS. It would also establish rules governing technology cooperation, material transfers, and regulatory oversight. On the process side, both governments are now preparing for detailed working level talks. These consultations are expected to cover not only submarine construction and operations, but also sensitive nuclear fuel cycle issues, including how to reconcile naval nuclear propulsion requirements with the existing US-ROK 123 Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, which currently limits nuclear material to peaceful use. The objective of these talks is to clarify how US domestic law, international safeguards, and alliance commitments would apply in the context of naval nuclear fuel, which is an area where legal precedent is limited and politically sensitive. At the diplomatic level, alliance coordination has already intensified. Recent engagements, including meetings between US Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, and senior South Korean officials, have emphasized that the nuclear submarine project is being framed as a way to strengthen deterrence and deepen alliance integration rather than as a standalone national program. Officials on both sides have also stressed the desire for early, tangible outcomes using existing diplomatic and defense channels to align expectations ahead of formal negotiations. In terms of institutional preparation, Seoul is trying to move quickly. The first meeting of the Korea-US Nuclear Cooperation Task Force, chaired by our government representative Rim Gap-soo, brought together officials from across the foreign affairs, nuclear safety, and non-proliferation communities. The task force recently reviewed enrichment and reprocessing issues and clarified intra-agency roles and agreed to pursue a phased whole-of-government approach. The Defense Ministry earlier this week also outlined its own timeline. But before that, in December, it said that it aims to secure nuclear fuel arrangements with the US within 2 years. Under the plan briefed to President Lee Jae Myung last year, the ministry said it will produce a detailed blueprint by the end of this year, covering development principles, construction plans, and South Korea's non-proliferation posture. It also plans to designate the nuclear submarine project as a national strategic initiative and prepare safety regulation for operating naval reactors. And the Defense Ministry, on top of that, earlier this week, created a special promotion team, which is a dedicated task force reporting directly up the chain to the Defense Minister on the SSN issue. Yes, and that's it.
Terrific outline. Thank you so much, Min-kyung. Clearly, a roadmap is starting to coalesce, and this is a top policy priority, it seems, for the Lee Jae Myung administration. So a lot coalescing around that. What's the mood in terms of the optimism about whether these legal and logistical engineering challenges can be surmounted within the time frame that's been laid out? Because this is going to be not an easy task. Any sense for whether there's optimism there or whether there's some concern about whether Korea is going to be able to pull everything together?
Well, there is definitely, but we're in very early stages and a lot of the projects haven't started yet. And as you know, recently President Trump has made threats about our tariffs as well. And I think that sparked concerns here about whether the nuclear submarine project is going to go forward, because it was very heavily related to the legislation that was kind of stuck in our parliament that is related to the tariff deal, and then how we were not following through with the investments that we promised to the US firms. So there is optimism, but it's also very cautious because of the pace of the negotiations.
Excellent. Really great insight. A complex landscape here. Jim, let's turn to you and back up a little bit and just talk about how are SSNs, as you recently wrote an article that was really terrific just about this topic, and folks, if they go to our program webpage, there's a link to it there. So how are these nuclear-powered submarines different from their diesel electric cousins? And in what circumstances does it make sense for a Navy to pursue SSNs? And does Korea's situation fit this bill?
Hey everybody, it's a privilege to take part this morning. I should tell you, I should preface my remarks by saying that I'm not here as an official U.S. government spokesman. I think it does make sense for Korea. A flotilla of 3 nuclear-powered attack boats should give the ROK Navy enough hulls to keep one constantly at sea, factoring in the rhythm of training, maintenance, repair, overhaul, and of course deployment at sea. The major advantages provided by naval nuclear propulsion are elusiveness, speed, and endurance. In theory, an SSN can remain underwater indefinitely and therefore cannot be caught on the surface with radar or visual detection the way a conventional sub can while it is snorkeling. That leaves acoustic detection, which is a difficult art for sub hunters. An SSN's propulsion plant produces enormous shaft horsepower, and it needs no fuel except possibly for midlife refueling, depending on the design. The cruise needs are the limiting factor on the length of a submarine cruise. Along with that, an SSN has very long cruising range relative to a diesel electric boat that needs regular refueling and must put into port to do it. The drawbacks of nuclear-powered subs are the upfront expense and the technical difficulties, but the United States has helped out allied navies master the technology before, and is doing so, as has been mentioned, with the Royal Australian Navy today under the AUKUS arrangement. Our first SSN, USS Nautilus, took to the sea for the first time in 1959. This is not new or insurmountable technology anymore.
Your article mentioned something really interesting, that overcapacity is waste. Could you explain that a little bit in the context of SSNs?
Well, societies, electorates don't like to waste money on armaments at peacetime. So if you do have too many assets for the mission, chances are you are going to end up in political difficulties. So again, but I think this once again, 3 submarines, 3 SSNs is probably enough for what South Korea needs to do, which would be to keep 1 boat on station at all given times. We're always talking about the pace of training, putting to sea, coming back home, overhauling and repairing. You simply get about one boat for every 3 hulls that you actually own. 2 if you're lucky, but mostly 1.
Terrific. Thanks very much. And we're going to follow up with the next question, which is, how will these SSNs actually improve South Korea's capabilities? You mentioned anti-sub, constant presence, and expanded range. If you could unpack that a little bit in South Korea's context.
Yeah, sure. Let me turn to the strategic dimension, since I talked just a little bit about the engineering dimension just now. Diesel subs are generally for hunting surface vessels and thus make excellent sea denial platforms, or access denial, as we talk about in the case of the PLA Navy. There is a reason the PLA Navy made conventional submarines the core of its access denial fleet early on in its naval buildup. SSNs are also excellent sea denial platforms, but they can operate against submarines as well as surface fleets. In fact, any U.S. submariner will tell you the best sub hunter is another sub. ROK Navy SSNs will open up new vistas for holding the DPRK Navy submarine fleet, including its ballistic missile subs, should they become a reality, at risk in peacetime or sinking it in wartime. In short, nuclear propulsion adds a dimension to naval warfare. In line with what I said before, nuclear propulsion will let the ROK Navy mount a near constant or constant presence in important waters, depending on how many hulls the Navy constructs. Think about what that does for South Korea in terms of deterrence and coercion. Subs and proficient crews are capability. If the leadership in Seoul displays the willpower to use that capability under conditions it says it will stand a good chance of making the Kim regime believers in that combination of capability and resolve. In South Korean strength and fortitude, in other words. That will cast a shadow across decision-making in Pyongyang, giving hostile leaders pause before they do something rash. That's what deterrence is all about. These are naval platforms with direct political heft.
Poetically put, Jim. Thank you so much. Song-Hyun, turning over to you, how do you think SSNs in the long term are going to affect Korea's contribution and coordination with the US-ROK alliance? And I want to point to a recent Sejong Institute report that said that this program signals a qualitative transformation and a historic turning point that broadens the strategic horizons of the US-South Korea alliance. So does this hint at a wider regional role for these nuclear-powered submarines?
Well, that's the ideal suggestion for the mission of the submarine. And people who supported the project take.
Still a little bit of issue with the microphone. So one idea could be to sign out of Zoom and then reconnect. And if you have a stronger,
Okay, I tried. I
yeah,
tried.
if there's anywhere in your house that has like a stronger connection to Wi-Fi, that's another idea. So thank you very much for that. Min-kyung, turning over to you because inter-Korean relations are going to be affected by South Korea's pursuit of SSN. So let's start with what has North Korea's response be? What has North Korea's response been so far? And how do you think this is going to impact the potential for inter-Korean relations and US-North Korea diplomacy?
So yes, Jonathan, from Pyongyang's perspective, SSNs are not viewed as defensive assets like South Korea has been claiming. North Korea has been framing them as first strike enablers that threaten the survivability of its nuclear forces, particularly its nascent sea-based deterrent. This perception hardens threat narratives and reduces incentives for restraint. Historically, inter-Korean relations have been most stable when both sides perceived a temporary balance or mutual vulnerability. SSNs would disrupt that balance by strengthening South Korea's ability to detect and neutralize North Korea's strategic assets. Obviously, North Korea's response has been predictably hostile, but also strategically revealing. Pyongyang has repeatedly cited South Korea's pursuit of advanced naval platforms, including SSNs, and US submarine deployments as justification for accelerating its own tactical nuclear weapons, SLBM development, and nuclear use doctrines. But on the other hand, South Korean officials have framed the SSN project as a way to maintain a nuclear conventional balance on the peninsula. Recently, our Foreign Minister Cho Hyun has argued that if North Korea continues to advance nuclear and missile capabilities, including potential nuclear-armed submarines, failing to preserve balance could fuel domestic calls for nuclear armament in South Korea. SSNs from this view are long-lived assets designed to prepare for future security environments and to contribute more broadly to maritime security as an international public good. The government has emphasized that it will strictly comply with international non-proliferation norms, arguing that strengthening independent defense capabilities while respecting global rules ultimately makes South Korea a more capable alliance partner rather than a destabilizing actor. Politically, the presidential office here has adopted a low reaction strategy towards North Korean criticisms on SSNs. Officials have dismissed Pyongyang's objections as opportunistic and stressed that SSN cooperation with the US will proceed as planned. Rather than responding rhetorically, Seoul appears intent on advancing implementation quietly and steadily. The core operational argument advanced by proponents is straightforward. The most effective way to counter a North Korean nuclear-powered submarine threat is the ability to persistently track and, if necessary, neutralize such platforms as a lead port. The stealth, endurance, and survivability of SSNs make them uniquely suited for that mission. In short, SSNs would strengthen South Korea's deterrence and alliance with the US, but at the cost of narrower diplomatic space with North Korea and heightened demands for careful crisis management.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Min-kyung. Very clarifying. Now we're going to shift gears and look at North Korea's nuclear-powered program that they are hoping to develop and their Navy writ large. So Min-kyung, let's start with you and ask, what do we know about North Korea's plan to build nuclear-powered attack submarines? And is there any evidence of Russian support for that plan? Very interesting episode recently happened about this.
Yes, so like you said, Jonathan, a very interesting episode happened. So North Korea in December exposed what it called an 8,700-ton class nuclear-powered strategic guided missile submarine. But it should be read less as a technical unveiling than as a strategic forcing move, because there were images of Kim Jong-un inspecting a largely assembled hull which, obviously as in North Korea, which is carefully choreographed to project momentum in naval nuclearization and imply progress toward a survivable sea-based nuclear deterrent, and compel Seoul and Washington to plan against a higher ceiling of risk before the capability is proven. The displacement claim and visual evidence of an advanced hull suggest meaningful progress in shipbuilding. However, a hull is only the visible part of a much larger system, we must always remember, and the decisive threshold lies elsewhere, which is always safe reactor operation, acoustic quieting, crew training, sustainment capacity, and secure command and control. So these are the elements that determine whether a submarine meaningfully alters the strategic balance. And nuclear-powered status cannot be verified through imagery alone, like I said. Naval nuclear propulsion requires not only a reactor, but an entire ecosystem. Even advanced navies treat nuclear propulsion as a generational institutional investment rather than a platform-specific achievement. And readiness is also another high bar for North Korea. A strategic submarine becomes strategically meaningful only after prolonged sea trials, crew certification, repeat deployments, and predictable maintenance cycles. These stages are where complex programs often falter. And if North Korea is attempting a leap to nuclear propulsion early operation, if they occur, would likely be training intensive and accident prone. So North Korea's messaging deliberately blurs categories. Pyongyang is benefiting when nuclear powered and nuclear armed are merged in external perceptions. Deterrent effect is created immediately if audiences assume that the most escalatory interpretation, regardless of whether propulsion claims are mature. Speculation about Russian assistance adds uncertainty, but not clarity. South Korean military authorities have stated that Russia may have transferred submarine propulsion modules in early 2025. Some analysts point to Russian reactor designs such as the VM-4SG or OK-650 pressurized water reactors as possible candidates. Others, however, remain skeptical, arguing that transferring entire reactor units would be technically and politically difficult, and that North Korea is more likely pursuing an indigenous design with external advisory support rather than a turnkey reactor delivery. Even if external assistance from Russia exists, it is not a shortcut to credibility. Safe reactor operation, discipline, and sustained deployment behavior cannot be easily imported from Russia. The prudent analytical stance for now is to treat foreign support as potential accelerator, not proof of success. And I think the timing of the reveal, which was in December last year, also matters. North Korea usually has a launch ceremony every time they reveal an important weapon. And the absence of such launch ceremony suggests the platform may not yet be ready. Instead, the disclosure appears intended to justify North Korea's nuclear expansion and counter South Korea and US cooperation on SSNs. In that sense, the exposure is less about completion and more about strategic signaling.
Thanks so much, Myung. Very astutely put. And now we're going to once again turn to Jim to zoom out and evaluate how North Korea's current submarine program is dispositioned, including its ballistic missile submarines, and how subs fit into North Korea's larger military strategy. So, Jim, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I should stress that I do no classified work, so my take on the North Korean Navy does not rely on insider knowledge. What I know about the subject comes from sources anyone can read. Having said that, weapon systems like subs are black boxes in peacetime. I can look at a vessel, I can count up numbers of hulls, I can estimate the technical performance of sensors and weapons, I can watch how the vessel performs in exercises and maneuvers, and form judgments about the crew's seamanship, tactical proficiency, and morale. In the end, though, a lot comes down to guesswork, as it always does in net assessment. Not everything we can count counts, not everything that counts can be counted. Combat is the arbiter of what does and doesn't work in naval warfare. Until one navy measures itself against another in battle, revealing its capabilities, doubt will always linger. Having said that, my personal guess is that the DPRK Navy has not somehow staged a leap to technological and human parity with the ROK Navy, the US Navy, or the JMSDF, but it can certainly make trouble even if it remains well behind. The Chonan sinking is a painful reminder of that. For example, the Soviet Navy operated a large contingent of technically backward boats, but sheer mass made the Soviets a formidable foe. They could simply flood the zone with hulls. The DPRK Navy would reap the same advantages from SSNs as the ROK Navy would, with the extra advantage that the North, as has been mentioned, wants to add an undersea nuclear deterrent to its maritime and military strategy. It could use SSNs for picket duty, guarding the SSBN flotilla. If it succeeds at fielding SSBNs and SSNs, and whether the Northern will master naval nuclear propulsion remains an open question. I am a skeptic. The DPRK Navy could try to create one or more bastions for its boomers, its SSBNs, using SSNs in conjunction with shore-based anti-access forces to fend off hostile anti-submarine forces. That was how the Soviet Navy approached undersea deterrence. China's Navy is replicating the approach in the South China Sea as best it can, and I would expect to see North Korea take a similar trajectory if they get the engineering right.
Thank you so much, Jim. Sang-hyun, over to you. And hopefully we've
Can you
got
hear me?
this is so much better.
I switched to MacBook, logged out of desktop.
Okay. Well, hey, MacBook for the win. How will South Korea's nuclear-powered submarines affect North Korea's power projection and balance of power on the peninsula? Because this will certainly change things, right, for North Korea's point of view.
Yeah, so far we believed that those Korean asymmetric threat, particularly nuclear, missile, and submarine loaded with SLBM, most people believed that that was a serious threat to South Korean security. But if South Korea have a nuclear-powered submarine, this will surely strengthen the military balance vis-a-vis North Korea by stabilizing asymmetric deterrence. In effect, it would erode the asymmetric advantage on which North Korea has traditionally relied. So far, North Korea has depended on asymmetric strategies centered on nuclear weapon and mobile missile forces, and I think recently they are evolving into a submarine and SLBM. Who knows? In someday, North Korea may have a nuclear weapon loaded within the submarine. So I think that's the path that North Korea is taking these days. So given that that's the current situation, South Korea's possession of SSN would signify a survivable retaliatory capability, one that could endure a North Korean first strike and still hold North Korean target at risk. So I think by having SSN itself will be a significant a symbolic and psychological threat burden to North Korean decision makers. So from Pyongyang's perspective, South Korean SSN would generate a significant pressure through persistent, covered, always-on threat. Okay, that blurs the distinction between peacetime and crisis and wartime. Don't matter. So continuous tracking of leadership and also continuous tracking of commander-linked targets in and around the North Korean coastal water, they will surely give some burden for North Korean decision maker. So regardless of whether an actual strike occurs or not, the mere possibility that South Korea could strike at any time and in a given at any place is already in position to, if any time is already in position to do so, would inject a constant psychological threat and uncertainty in the North Korean strategic calculus. So by persistently monitoring and potentially interdicting North Korean SLBM test areas, for example, and also submarine-based access route and maritime training and logistic lines, South Korean SSN would significantly degrade and potentially neutralize North Korea's asymmetric military advantage. So I think it is kind of a balancing on the one hand, and also by adding some unpredictable way of a pressing those kind of regime, I think that will be a substantial asset for Korea in the coming years.
Thank you so much, Sang-hyun. Yeah, and you wonder how this type of capability will affect North Korean confidence of escalation control and escalation dominance on the peninsula. Certainly cause them to second guess that. let's turn to China, because China is undoubtedly affected by all of these developments. So Min-kyung, can you first start by telling us a little bit about China's response to the agreement thus far and why some analysts have called it a muted response?
Thank you, Jonathan. China's response to South Korea's pursuit of nuclear-powered submarines has been very cautious, measured, and notably restrained when compared to Beijing's reaction to earlier regional security developments, such as AUKUS or the THAAD development. In previous cases, China responded with overt political pressure and coercive signaling. When AUKUS was announced, Chinese officials condemned it as an extremely irresponsible act that undermined the global non-proliferation regime and destabilized regional security. Similarly, following South Korea's deployment of the THAAD missile system around 2016 and 2017, Beijing imposed broad and formal economic retaliation targeting South Korean companies, tourism, and cultural exports, while framing THAAD as a direct threat to China's strategic deterrent. By contrast, Beijing's reaction to South Korea-US cooperation on SSNs have been compared relatively muted. Chinese officials have raised concerns, but largely through measured diplomatic language rather than public denunciation. Statements from the Chinese Foreign Ministry and ambassadorial channels have emphasized the need for prudence, respect for non-proliferation norms, and preservation of regional stability without declaring outright opposition or threatening retaliation. I believe this restraint reflects the more complex strategic calculus. It is probably because China is reluctant to repeat the THAAD playbook, which ultimately pushed South Korea closer to the United States and hardened public opinion in Seoul against Beijing. Instead, China appears intent on signaling concern while avoiding actions that could accelerate South Korea's strategic realignment with Washington. This interpretation is reinforced by recent high-level diplomacy, during which President Lee Jae Myung's summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping in Beijing earlier this month. Lee explained that South Korea's pursuit of nuclear-powered submarines is defensive in nature, aimed at countering North Korea's expanding nuclear and missile capabilities, rather than altering the regional balance against China. According to South Korean officials, Xi did not raise objections or issue public warnings during the meeting, which was an absence that has been widely interpreted in Seoul as a sign of deliberate restraint rather than approval. Our National Security Advisor Ri Sung-lak later characterized discussions on the submarine issue with China as uneventful, saying there were no major problems or objections raised during diplomatic exchanges. He stressed that Seoul would continue to explain its intentions transparently while pursuing its defense modernization within the framework of international non-proliferation norms.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Min-kyung. And one wonders, right, just how much acknowledgement there is in Beijing about how North Korea's continual development of new nuclear platforms is really driving the arms race on the Korean Peninsula and responsible for the creation of that dilemma, and thus acknowledging that South Korea has to do something in order to meet that threat. I think a little bit of frustration in Beijing over what North Korea has done recently, including its actions in Ukraine. So those are interesting developments to watch. So Sung-hyun, turning to you now, the US has asked South Korea to contribute more to regional deterrence. And so in that context, I wonder how these SSNs will impact South Korea's relationship with China.
Well, I think that's the most complicated and difficult part of this project. Obviously, US policymakers will expect South Korea to do some role or function in check and balance against China, for example, in Taiwan contingency case. But if South Korea is being involved in that contingency, what does that mean between Korea and China? It will direct hostile relationship. And given the past experience, South Korea can barely afford it. As a third experience, it clearly shows that China has much more measure to revenge against the South Korea action. So given that, but also we would say that China already has many nuclear powered submarine and nuclear submarine SSBN around the Korean Peninsula. They are operating, and on the east coast of the Korean Peninsula, Donghae, East Sea or Japan Sea, there's a training ground for both China and Russian submarines. And already they are operating and frequently pass through that area. And given that China will not have much rationality to stop South Korea to build SSN to deter those Korean threat. Okay, so as Myung said, President Lee Jae Myung, when he visited China, he clearly explained that our SSBN is not intended to check and function against the China. Is the sole purpose is the checking those Korean threat. And also, more broader political diplomatic perspective, China has no reason to intentionally antagonize Korea-China relations these days. Overall, Chinese decision makers fully understand that South Korean public perception about China is worst ever recently, because Korean people are quite concerned about China's bullying behavior toward the small neighboring countries. And given that if China have another that kind of bullying policy, I believe that Korea-China relations will be damaged almost irrecoverably. Okay. Yeah. So, but always that this is the time that we need a little more caution. Think about after South Korea has SSN, and there are many more on those Korean submarines around the Korean Peninsula, and even Chinese and Russian submarines are all moving around the Korean Peninsula. So unless there is some kind of a crisis or out of control mechanism to control the unintended escalation or dispute or conflict or whatever, I think that's quite a dangerous moment that can happen anytime around the Korean Peninsula. So we all know that every country around the Korean Peninsula, but even those Korea, South Korea, China, Russia, they all operate somewhere around this area. This is quite a crowded sea. Okay, so if that's the situation, perhaps we need a little more standard procedure or kind of a transparency approach to handle to avoid the unexpected or unwanted conflict in this area. Yeah.
Terrific perspective. And now if we switch from the East Sea to the West Sea, Jim, there's been some tension there between Korea and China recently, with China building some maritime structures that contradict a fisheries agreement made between Korea and China way back in 2001. So can you tell us a little bit about what's going on there?
Sure, you might call Chinese moves a low-grade form of creeping encroachment via the gray zone, in contrast to the much higher profile gray zone operations in the South China Sea and the waters around the Senkaku Islands. Beijing is trying to create facts using physical structures, much as it constructed and fortified artificial islands to anchor its unlawful claims to sovereignty within the 9-dash line in the South China Sea. So kudos to your leadership for pushing back on that. The good news is, I think China is finding that Northeast Asia is far less hospitable to a gray zone offensive than the South China Sea, where outmatched competitors like the Philippines and Vietnam pose the major obstacle, or even around the Senkakus, Japanese-administered islets that lie far from the Japanese home islands. Patrolling those islands stretches the Japan Coast Guard and JMSDF operationally, while the larger China Coast Guard operates there with impunity from bases along the China coast. So the geographic dimension is huge, as are the capabilities of China's rivals. Korea enjoys the same advantages of geographic proximity to contested real estate that China does off the Korean west coast. It operates a compact but first-rate navy, and it has powerful allies nearby to boot. That constitutes a much more formidable impediment to Beijing's maritime ambitions than found in other theaters in the Indo-Pacific.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jim. And now it's our turn to ask our audience, what they would like to say. So we're taking those live. So let us know, policy@koreasociety.org if you have questions. And we have a couple preloaded, turning over to Chelsea to deliver those.
All right, thank you guys for such an interesting and moderated discussion. I'm going to start off with a question from one of our members, and that's assigned to anyone watching that if you become a member of the Korea Society, we will prioritize your questions for our distinguished guests. And so the first question I've got here is from Benjamin Wampler, a university student. He asks, how is South Korea preparing for pushback from neighboring countries regarding its possession of nuclear submarines? We've talked about China, Russia, and North Korea's responses, but any other countries that you guys might have in mind and their responses? And this is a free-for-all question, so feel free to jump in whenever you'd like.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. You listed. Oh, thanks, Chelsea. You listed 3 countries. You didn't list Japan. I think that certainly bears watching, given the prop pass. But it feels like things are on the mend between Japan and South Korea. But obviously they have a very painful past. So I would certainly look for indicators out of the new Japanese government and out of the JMSDF and the self-defense forces at large to see just how this is playing across the Tsushima Strait in Japan. So that would certainly be a way to gauge exactly what the response is going to be there. And of course, the United States as well. We formed an agreement with the ROK, but nonetheless, there are midterm elections coming up here in the United States that could influence the course of the nuclear submarine project as well as U.S. diplomacy in the region as a whole.
Okay, may I jump in?
Yes, please.
Think about China and Russia. They are they're operating SSBN, not SSN. This is far more threatening from Korea's perspective. And because of that, that's why current Korean President Lee Jae Myung expressed to Chinese authority that this is not intended to threat either China or Russia. I think that's the baseline that South Korea stands. And also because of that, even though South Korea acquired SSN, it will not constitute a direct threat to either to China or Russia. But one of the equation that we have to look at is that those Korean progress in their submarine capabilities. As we discussed earlier, that those Korea a while ago they revealed what called a nuclear powered attack submarine. So meaning that North Korea is trying to evolve in that path. They will develop their own nuclear powered submarine, and given the shape of the tower, probably we can guess that some launch tube may be fitting that submarine. What does that mean? Sooner or later, North Korea come up with a nuclear powered submarine loaded with nuclear weapons, SSBN. I think that's the kind of scenario we anticipate. So because of that, who can stop North Korea? South Korea cannot. I don't think South Korea can do it. And even though China or Russia try to pressure North Korea to stop that, North Korea will go their way. And these days, Russia, in a somewhat showing the attitude to acknowledge support North Korea's SSBN program. So I think that's the unwanted scenario, and quite can be dangerous in the future. So that's the scenario that we face, South Korea. That's the threat perception we have. And even though we have a SSN, because we do not load with a nuclear bomb, and I think that's the kind of a minimal deterrence against those kind of threat. So that's understandable. Neighboring nation will not like very much about South Korean project, but South Korea should also pay attention to its worsening security environment. I think that's the kind of attitude we have to keep it.
I'll just jump in to say, I love those points, Song-hyun. Why would China and Russia have frustration with North Korea's nuclear arms building? And it's because it quite reasonably induces South Korea, Japan, and the United States to take measures to counteract in order to restore deterrence. So look back to the agreement between Xi Jinping and Moon Jae-in after the THAAD dispute, the 3 no's, which were Korea agreed to no additional THAAD batteries, no linked regional ballistic missile defense architecture, and no trilateral formal alliance between the US, Korea, and Japan, right? So like China is very clearly voicing what its concerns are, but is at a certain point forced to acknowledge that that's the direction that things are going if North Korea continues unfettered. So I can sense frustration in Beijing over these dynamics. Yeah.
But there are many people indicate that these days, even China have some leverage over North Korea. Is quite difficult to persuade them. North Korea simply does not listen what China is saying.
And is that because of the new relationship with Moscow?
That may be one explanation, but it is North Korea's own way of development. They want to survive by its own.
And then, so I'll jump over to another question kind of related to inter-Korean relations. We have one from Karita Reed from the CNA Corporation, and she asks whether the development of nuclear submarines puts South Korea behind in trying to engage with North Korea, and kind of what is the end development of the nuclear submarines vis-a-vis inter-Korean relations. And I know we've kind of touched on the worsening security environment due to South Korea pursuing this, but how does this kind of relate to, what are the implications for rapprochement?
Okay, let's start with Migyeok. You have something to say?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question was the SSN's setback engagement with North Korea, right?
Yep.
So SSN's likely reduce near-term diplomatic space with North Korea because Pyongyang tends to interpret advanced alliance capabilities as hostile intent and uses them as justification to disengage or demand front-loaded concessions. However, the government's logic here is consistent with the public framing, is that the end goal is deterrence and risk reduction through strength, not engagement per se, which is maintaining a nuclear conventional balance without South Korea going nuclear and reinforce alliance burden sharing and extended deterrence credibility. We believe that Seoul views nuclear propulsion as essential for countering North Korea's evolving undersea missile threats while maintaining its non-proliferation stance. So the policy objective is framed as strategic stability through improved denial and tracking, not as a bargaining chip. So to the question, yes, SSNs may set engagement back in the short run, but Seoul's argument now is that engagement without deterrent credibility is unsustainable anyway, and that a stronger deterrent posture can eventually create conditions where diplomacy is eventually less coercive and more predictable.
Okay, let me add a few more points. Think about South Korean government, current government. This is a liberal, progressive government. Most of you understand that in Korea, and North Korea policy fluctuates when which party is taking power in government. Usually, liberals or progressives, they pursue peace first, conservative, security first. So peace and security in these two pillars, two extreme policy always fluctuates in South Korea and North Korea policy. So current government is a liberal government, and also there's a long tradition in liberal section of the South Korea society that they want a more rapprochement, peace, stable, peaceful coexist with North Korea. But North Korea's nuclear missile submarine is a reality that we cannot ignore. So this is the kind of a very tricky situation. So let me say it like this. South Korea does not seek an adversarial relationship with North Korea. The denuclearization of North Korea remains a long-term, eventual objective. But in reality, there's no hope that North Korea will give up their nuclear weapon program soon. So that's why Lee Jae Myung government said that freeze, reduce and eventually denuclearization. This is a very, very long-term process of the those kind of policy. So what's the end state? Of course, that's the peaceful denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. I think that's the unchanged goal of the South Korean government, be it liberal or conservative. But as I said, we must also, that's a long-term goal. But on the ground, in reality, those current threat is increasing and imminent and threatening. They are missiles, nuclear weapons, submarines, or they are all pose a real threat to South Korea. And South Korea cannot ignore that as well. So while responding to these threats, South Korea continues to pursue the ultimate goal of denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula. I think that's the end state that most Korean people want.
I wonder how North Korea's decision to designate South Korea as its principal enemy is now and in the near-term future shrinking the policy space in Seoul, right? You have a government that is very oriented towards using engagement to drive diplomatic change. But things are so different from when we saw the Olympic spring season of summitry that led to the meetings between Presidents Trump and Kim Jong-un in Singapore and Hanoi, where South Korea was playing that mediator role very assertively, right? And now, if you read statements by Kim Yo-jong, if you read what Kim Jong-un is saying, that role seems to be difficult in the near term for South Korea to perform.
Yeah. Well, comparing with the current time as the 2017 or 18 situation is completely different. Going back to 2017 and 18, if South Korea says something, those could at least show some direction. These days, nothing, completely nothing. There are many theories about why North Korea designated South Korea as an enemy, but it's a long story, and there are many reasons. North Korea may have for some domestic political reason as well, and also they wanted to completely cut out the bad influence coming inside North Korea from particularly South Korea. Okay, so given South Korea is in terms of economy, South Korean systems are quite superior to North Korea. So North Korea does not want to continue normal interaction with South Korea. That's why they designate the South Korea enemy. And once they declared South Korea as an enemy, there's no reason to communicate or respond and in interaction. Okay. So given, as I said, in comparison, 2017-18 situation was much more favorable to inter-Korean relations, but these days, completely disappointing. And today I met several diplomats in South Korea, and they said that there's no communication channel error, either government, NGOs, whatever. So that's the even in New York channel does not function as well. So the situation is quite worse these days. But still, I believe North Korea will not unilaterally treat South Korea as an enemy and try to make some more hostile action toward South Korea, because they understand if something happens in Korean Peninsula, their regime is also not safe.
Right. There is the lingering hope that the Ninth Party Congress could introduce some policy changes that could open the door to.
Yeah, that's the one of the watching point that many North Korea experts in Korea, South Korea say that.
Song Yun said, so he said something very general in nature and also pretty profound. I mean, naming an adversary in peacetime is it's a two-edged sword. For an armed force, you have to have somebody to measure yourself against in order to have a strategy. So I mean, for example, the Imperial Japanese Navy named the United States Navy the next big thing to come in the Pacific in 1907, not long after the Russo-Japanese War. So that's the upside. You need somebody to keep you sharp. But as he pointed out, that also can make you very fatalistic about the prospect of eventual conflict, and that's a dangerous thing from a political standpoint. So there are definite operational and force design upsides, but the political downsides could be pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, Jim, I think that's a really great point there. And I guess I want to end us on a question that was earlier addressed, but just wondering if anyone had any further thoughts. From Tracy Wilson, OTH Analysis LLC, she asks about how South Korea plans to address the IAEA safeguards aspects of pursuing this nuclear submarine program, excuse me. And so any thoughts on like the nuclear non-proliferation implications? I know you guys have mentioned that South Korea is still trying to maintain those commitments, but just trying to address those concerns that some of our audience members might have about that.
Okay, may I respond? So at the initial remark, I said that one of the controversy in South Korean SN is the fuel, enriched fuel. Okay, South Korea cannot independently enrich uranium fuel, whether it is for civilian nuclear reactor or submarine, whatever. That's completely strictly controlled by Korean US nuclear agreement. And also, given NPT's fundamental nature, South Korea can make a nuclear weapon if we withdraw from NPT. But as long as we are a member of the NPT, there's one obligation. We have to sign a safeguard contract with the IAEA. So because South Korea is not a nuclear weapon state, and also we do not have a privilege to enrich uranium fuel for either civilian or military use, if South Korea have a enriched nuclear fuel, HALEU 90.75% or whatever, okay, there'll be always controversy about is it good with the NPT or non-proliferation regime. So in order to prevent that controversy, South Korea needs a very strict agreement with IAEA to safeguard the nuclear material. And of course, the primary focus of a consultation with the IAEA is to clarify the legal basis for permitting naval nuclear propulsion by non-nuclear weapon state. South Korea is a non-nuclear weapon state under the NPT. And Article 3 of the NPT, together with the IAEA Model Safeguard Agreement, INFCIRC 153, leaves open the possibility of using nuclear material for non-explosive military purpose. However, that nuclear propulsion for submarine constitutes one of the most sensitive and ambiguous cases. So thereby, we need a more strict safeguard agreement with IAEA.
I guess I'll thank you for that, Dr. Lee. I will open it up to our other guests as well for any parting thoughts. Otherwise, we can also turn it over to Jonathan to close us out. But if anyone else has anything that they'd like to mention or say related to anything that we've addressed here or not addressed in this program.
Well, I think to add on to what Sang-Hyun said just now, I think a lot of people are saying that South Korea, when we are dealing with the IAEA, South Korea should take note from the Australia under AUKUS, where Australia formally requested the IAEA, and the IAEA has issued formal updates to member states on how such an arrangement would work, including durations, when safeguards would reapply, and how integrity is maintained. So I believe it's very important to cooperate with South Korea's allies and the countries nearby in processing this.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, I was just going to double back to a technical point about submarines' operational effectiveness. I do this because you hear it all the time that people sort of denigrate diesel electric submarines. You know, they're old, they're slow, they can be detected. Well, I mean, keep in mind what the United States submarine force in the Pacific did to the Japanese, Japan in World War II, operating from bases very far away until we started moving across the Pacific and getting closer to patrol grounds. Sank over 1,100 merchantmen to the point where the Japanese industry had to choose between replacing warship losses and replacing merchant losses. You basically dismembered the Japanese empire, which of course was a scattered maritime empire that relied on seaborne traffic in between the islands. So I would like to. I'm probably cutting against the grain of this session, which is about nuclear propulsion, but at the same time, we shouldn't denigrate too much. In fact, I've been on record over the years advocating that the United States obtain a squadron of diesel-electric submarines and forward base them permanently in the region, because you can do a lot of access denial type things there without breaking the bank like you do on a nuclear submarine. So just to leaven the discussion here just a little bit, I thought I would put that in.
And we do see a movement towards autonomous platforms, small, cheap platforms.
There you go. There's the next big thing: AI-enabled underwater drones and whatnot.
Those sorts of
partially related to that issue is the technical complexity and of course a huge cost to support the submarine program. As you say, what the experts say, looking at what's happening in Ukraine is that you mentioned autonomous weapon, okay, unmanned drones and even underwater drone. I think that's the kind of a trends in the future. If that's the case, why do we have to spend the huge money in that ugly big platform? I think that's the other side of the argument. Yeah. And also think about the technical complexity. Even though South Korea has a good experience in building a submarine, and many people say that because we are having a good experience in running a nuclear reactor, but building a small reactor, very quiet, that may fit in submarine is a completely different issue. So technically more complicated, and also more noise level should be quite small. And I think even though South Korea builds a small reactor for submarine, it will pass through many kinds of a test in ground test and underwater test, etc. And also think about the cost. How much submarine will cost for South Korea? I took some statistics from the news media. Usually building one submarine, usually about 5,000 tons size, which South Korea think. Either one submarine will cost the 3 trillion Korean won, which is the 2.0 or 2.1 billion US dollar. So if we run the submarine program, at least we need 3 or 4 submarines at a time. That means that total 6 to 8.4 billion dollar may be necessary to run that, to only build a submarine. But we need also special facilities to control the radioactive material, and also special dock to maintain nuclear submarine, and also train the manpower to run that submarine. So the cost will be huge. Okay? You know, in South Korea, do you know how much is the South Korea defense budget for 2026? Is 44 billion. And adding, given that size of the defense budget, and think about the about 8 billion or plus extra $1 billion for maintaining that program. So of course the cost itself may be spread over a long time, about 10 or 15 years. Though temporarily it may not be a big burden, but as I said, in 10 years, if the battleground situation is completely changed, why do you have to spend that money on that big platform? Right. So the issue is quite more complicated than just we see. Okay? That's what my point.
That's a great point. What is the opportunity cost here, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of, is this the right platform for the right time, for the future battlefield that South Korea will be expected to participate in if things deteriorate? So excellent points.
there's actually another case aside from AUKUS that South Korea ought to study, and it's Brazil. The Brazilian Navy has desperately been trying to build a nuclear submarine for years, and as best I can tell, they only want one. So right there, they would incur all those infrastructure costs and all those personnel costs and whatnot to maintain a fleet of one. Very different operating environment in the South Atlantic, and they seem to want it to control their exclusive economic zone and enforce fishing rights, which seems kind of like an odd use for a nuclear powered submarine. But none the case. Nonetheless, if you're talking about building a very small fleet, that might be worth a look as you all proceed.
Interesting. Okay, so this has been such a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I came into this conversation with not that much knowledge on nuclear submarines, and I'm leaving with more than that, thanks to you all. I am so grateful for our panelists, Dr. Jim Holmes, Dr. Sang-Hyun Lee, Min-Kyung Jung. Thank you so much for lending us your expertise, and to our audience for joining us today. Thank you to the Korea Society staff here, Chelsea, Peter, Bradley, Dr. Abraham Kim, and our wonderful interns, Jenna and Hannah, who have supported this endeavor. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and join us back here at the Korea Society February 3rd. That's next Tuesday at 6:30. We have a program, Prospects for Relations with North Korea. We'll be joined with our partners at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and Columbia University's APEC Study Center. Our speakers are Keith Luz, Susan Thornton, Rachel Min-Young Lee, and
Anke Panda.
Anke Panda. Can't forget Anke Panda. So real expert lineup. So very excited for that. Join us in person here and online as well. Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Guys.
Okay, thank you for hosting this program.
Thank you,
you.
Jonathan,
Bye.
as well. You always forget yourself.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, guys. Really terrific.